Welcome to Bible Mine. We're going to talk about a single gentleman tonight, which is different because it seems like a lot of times we try to take on a lot all at once. But we're going to use this to launch into a discussion tonight about atheism. And the question was brought up a few weeks back. You brought it up, and I told you it had been kind of on my mind, and when you'll see why in a minute, but this seemed like a good point to launch into talking about that. So I don't know if, and I think I said something about it last week, you realize we have now covered 1,000 years of the church. The church started with power in the Holy Spirit and quickly spread throughout the known world. And it had many highs and lows. You know, they've gone through a lot of things in this time. What in this study, those of you who have been here, what are some of your takeaways in our first 1,000 years? And that's kind of one of my takeaways too. That we seem to think that the things that we face today as a church are new and unique, and we found out that not even a pandemic is new and unique to the church. I mean, everything we're facing today, the church has gone through that. And guess what? The church is still here. I was having a conversation with somebody just this week. Actually, 2 times this came up. And, you hear a lot about, the church is in trouble. And, you hear these statistics, which, I don't know, where do they get these things? I'm going to share some statistics with you tonight. And same question applies. Where do they get these things? But we hear these percentages, and you hear about church closures, and you hear about all this. But here's one thing to think about. In the history of the world, there are more Christ followers on the planet right now than ever before. The church is not dead. The church is not going away. And so we haven't got 2,000 years yet, but just in our first 1,000, if that first 1,000 years is any indication, the church can survive a lot. The church can take a lot. You know why? Because we serve a big God, and Jesus is able to get us through. That's right. And so, the church has had problems, and the church faces things and goes through crisis and these different types of moments, but the church will survive. Well, today we're going to talk about a man by the name of Anselm. For some reason, that's not just a name that rolls off the tongue to me, but Anselm. He was an Italian-born theologian and philosopher. He's known as the father of scholasticism, and which is a philosophical school of thought that dominated the Middle Ages. He's recognized in modern times as the originator of the ontological argument for the existence of God, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. But ontology is it's like a philosophical explanation of the existence of something. Okay, so in other words, without faith and without, we're talking more in philosophy than faith when we're talking about ontology. He's also considered the originator of the satisfaction theory of atonement or redemption, and so we're going to discuss that briefly later as well. He's said to be the greatest religious thinker remember we talked about Augustine, okay, so between Augustine and we haven't got to Thomas Aquinas. Anybody ever heard that name? Okay, so between Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, you have Anselm, and I've heard of both of those, but I've never heard of this guy. But he's supposed to be the greatest religious thinker between those two. He authored many books. There's a lot of works that are attributed, and we're only going to really mention 2 today, but he has extensive writing that still exists to this day. Anselm was born in Aosta, Italy in 1033. Aosta is way up in the top. I mean, it's like right at the end of Italy, of the very northern part of Italy, at the foot of the Alps. Okay? How would you like that to be your backyard? That would be pretty cool. So this is where he grew up. His mother, Ermenberga. Anybody know anybody named Ermenberga? No? Okay. Anyway, she belonged to a noble Burgundian family and possessed considerable property. She was a devoted Christian and taught Anselm about Christ at a very early age, and so she instilled knowledge of Christ into him. His father, Gandolfo, he was also a Lombard nobleman, and he was an abusive drunk and quite violent at times. And so you had this dynamic going on in the family, and, you know, it's a reality of life. Sometimes you have that where you have one parent is trying to instill godly values, and you have the other parent that's just the total opposite. And this is kind of the environment that Anselm grew up in. And so the home was disrupted by tension between the two at all times. Anselm would later write about having to flee to his mother for protection from the violent threats of his father. And so not a very stable home that he grew up in. Even though home life was in turmoil, he had a deep sense of God. Even as a small boy, he just seemed to have an awakening and a hunger for God, and I'm sure his mom had a lot to do with that. But, you know, some people, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but, you know, some people seem to get it. You know what I'm saying? They really have an awareness of God, and they pursue that. And some people, it just seems like, you know, you just really have to stay on them and really try to help them understand. Well, Anselm really got it. When he was about 7 years old, he had a dream that impacted him so much that it's really going to continue to follow him all the days of his life, even into his adulthood. And he writes about this dream that he had. His mother would always say, when she was talking about God, she would refer to him as God on high. God lives on high. We've heard that term, right? Think about a 7-year-old boy that lives at the foot of the Alps, and his mother saying, God on high. What are you thinking?
Top of the mountain.
God lives up here. And so he had often just kind of daydreamed or thought about, you know, someday I'm going to go on a hike, and I'm going to find me a trail, and I'm going to go up there, and I'm going to see God.
Yeah.
All right? That's kind of, you know, his little boy mentality. That's where he was. And so he had a dream one night when he was 7 years old, and this dream followed that school of thought, or that maybe kind of that daydream or thoughts that he had, and he went on such a hike. And so he hikes up into this mountain, and as he's going along the path, he sees people out laboring for the Lord. But they're not doing so really with their whole hearts. They're not doing so the way that they should be. They're not completely obeying God, and they're really in error as they're supposedly working for the Lord. And so Anselm says, you know what, I'm going to go up here to God, and I'm going to tell on them. And so he trots on up, you know, and he's going to tell God on all these people that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Anybody ever had those thoughts before? You know, yeah. I just want to tell on somebody. And so this is what Anselm wanted to do. So he gets up there, and he actually he's you know, makes it to God's house, and he's ushered in, and everything's beautiful and everything's wonderful, and he gets to sit down and have a conversation with God, and God's answering all his questions, and he forgets all about telling God about all these people that wasn't doing right. I mean, he just kind of you know, and doesn't that sound kind of accurate?
Yes.
You know, we have all these things that, how many of you ever said, you know, hey, you know, I don't understand, but when I get to heaven, I'm going to understand. When you get to heaven, you're not going to care about some of these things that we have questions about today. Everything's going to be so great and so wonderful and so amazing, and the presence of God is going to be so overwhelming that you're just going to forget about all the things in life that right now you're scratching your head over. And so this is the experience that Anselm had. He gets up there, and God answers all these questions, and he wakes up and he tells his mother about this dream. And the response is like, oh, that's cute. Not really the response he was hoping for, you know. He tells his dad about the dream, and his dad just kind of dismisses him. Of course, that's not the kind of thing his dad wanted to hear about anyway. And so he tells his friends about it, and all his friends laugh at him. Yeah. And so, you know, what are you going to do? You know, you just kind of internalize it, and, you know, maybe one day it'll make some sense somewhere. Between the dream itself and reactions to it, the experience had a lasting impression on his life. And his mother died when he was about 12 years old. And so, I mean, in effect, he lost his protector at 12. things got really bad with his father after that. And at 15, he tried to enter a monastery because maybe, with his deep devotion to God and really wanting to get away from his father maybe. But at that age, he had to have his father's consent, which his father wouldn't give, so the monastery rejected him. So finally, he leaves home as a young man, and he goes, I don't think I have I could go back to that map or whatever, but he wandered. Remember, we've talked about the Frankish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and we've talked about those. So just picture that map, if you will. He just goes on a wandering trip for 3 or 4 years, just kind of just wanders around and maybe picking up odd jobs or just trying to make it the best he can. Maybe he had to resort to begging for food from time to time. And so let's pause right there for a moment. There is a story, a thing that we didn't really cover, and for good reason. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it fits into this story, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit. Remember when we were talking about the Vikings that were invading? So the Vikings came down and they tried to invade the Frankish kingdom right here. And so they settled in this area right here. Does anybody know what area that is? Just
France.
Okay, well, all this is France, but there you go, Normandy. All right, so they settle right here, and so there's a lot of skirmishes back and forth. The Vikings are trying to invade, and the Franks are trying to hold them back. And so finally, they just came to a standstill thinking, all right, so nobody's winning here, so let's just call a truce. You just keep that red land right there, and we'll just keep all this other stuff. We'll leave you alone, you leave us alone, and that seemed to work for everybody. And so they became known as the Northmen because they were up here in the north. Northmen over time started turning into, they were the Normans. Instead of the Northmen, they were the Normans, and so this became Normandy. All right? So if you wanted to know where that came from. So the area was eventually Christianized, and around 1034, a Norman knight named Herluin. I'm not really sure of the pronunciation of that name. Some I try to look up. This one I just took a stab at. So Herluin, he left the king's court and he founded an abbey called the Abbey of Beck. So this is the Abbey of Beck, or what's standing of it today. And Beck was actually a river that ran through there, and so the abbey was named for this river. So it was the Abbey of Beck. He wanted it to be really more than just a religious center, though. He wanted it to be like this big center of learning and where information could be gathered and thought could be promoted. And so he gathered some of the best thinkers that he could find in the religious community to come to this abbey and to be part of what was going on there. In 1042, he hired one of the greatest minds of that day, and his name, anybody know his name? I didn't think so. Lanfranc. So this is Lanfranc. He was widely regarded as one of the greatest religious thinkers of that time. Anselm arrives at Beck after 3 or 4 years of wandering around. He gets to the abbey, and he meets Lanfranc and wanted to study under him. He had this desire of pursuing God and learning more of God. And so Lanfranc sat down with him and talked. And he was really impressed with Anselm and just the way that he understood things and the way that he could articulate his beliefs and things like this. And so Lanfranc thought, I see some value in this guy, so I really need to bring him into that abbey. And, at first, when Anselm first got there, he was just looking for his next meal. Well, next thing you know, he joins the abbey. In 1060, Anselm entered the abbey as a novice, and his intellectual and spiritual gifts brought him rapid advancement. In 1063, Lanfranc was transferred by a guy named William. He has a "the" after it. William the... William the Conqueror. There you go. William the Conqueror. Hey, I would be just as blank. So, but I have notes. Ha ha. So William the Conqueror was the king of the Normans, and he had set his sights on England. He felt, and I'm not going to get into that whole story, but he felt like he had rights to England, and so he was going to set his sights on conquering England. Besides, his name was William the Conqueror, and so you have to conquer, if that's part of your name. And so, what's that?
We're agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. And so he moved Lanfranc to a more strategic abbey because he really wanted to bring Lanfranc to England with him and set him up, because if you're going to take over England, which right now was Christianized and everybody was, looking for good spiritual leadership, he knew I better bring somebody that's a good spiritual leader along with me to kind of satisfy that need. And so this is what he had set Lanfranc up to. So that pulls Lanfranc away from the Abbey at Beck. And in 1063, with Lanfranc leaving, the other monks overwhelmingly convinced Anselm to take Lanfranc's place as the head of the abbey. And that's not really what he wanted to do. Anybody ever have a job thrust upon you that you didn't really want? It's like, don't really want it, but, I feel like I better do this. So he took over the abbey at the age of 30, actually, and accepted this honor. For the next 10 years, he wrote extensively and he taught. And so this is where a lot of his books and a lot of his writings came into play. And we're going to talk about just two of his works real briefly. One of them is called Deus Homo, which simply means in Latin, why God man. Now we've talked about this in other arguments and in other times, but it's a philosophical defense of the Council of Chalcedon, which took place in 451, which affirmed that Christ was fully God and fully man. And so he's answering the question, why does he need to be fully God, fully man? The church had an instinct that our salvation depends on the two natures being expressed in that one person. And we've really covered this extensively in our own studies in the past. But it's really a mystery how this could happen, right? Do we agree? And the church never shied away from it being a mystery. It's okay for some things about God to be mysterious. How arrogant would I be if I thought I could understand all about an infinite God with my finite mind? And so, exactly. And so the church is okay with this being a mystery. But though the church had always professed this, there had never really been a good solid defense of the position as to why. So Anselm takes on the question, why God man? Now, this is really an oversimplified summary of the book and doesn't do it justice, but you'll kind of know where this comes from. And it's really an argument that you've heard before, but you didn't know where it came from. So God created us to honor him and glorify him, and the slightest infraction of that, we owe an infinite debt that we cannot repay. And so the least failure of our responsibility, we owe God just an incalculable debt that can't be paid. And remember, Jesus had a parable about this. What was that parable? You remember the servant that owed 10,000 pounds or 10,000 talents, literally is what it says. That comes out to be 750,000 pounds. Now, if that's a talent of gold, it could be a talent of gold or a talent of silver. If it was a talent of gold, that debt was $21.5 trillion. Basically, the United States national debt. Basically. And I don't know, when I was calculating that out, I'm one of those nerds that, if I see something talent, and so I looked up, what a talent was, and then I was like, okay, if it's a talent of gold, and I looked up the current price of gold, my first thought after I saw the $21.5 trillion, I wonder if somehow that's prophetic about the United States. I don't know. That's not part of today's lesson. But this is what we owe God in our slightest sin. I mean, the slightest little thing that you do that steps outside and misses the mark, that's the debt that you owe. Now, that's not to even mention compounded. How many of you have sinned more than once in your life? Yes. So $21.5 trillion for every one. How much do you owe? Okay, we owe a lot. So I think we've established that. So the only person that could ever pay a debt like that to God would be God. But God doesn't owe the debt. So why would he pay the debt if he doesn't owe the debt? And so, it's humans that owe this debt. And so Anselm surmises that the only one that could pay the debt must have the same dignity as God, but must be able to stand in the place of man. You've heard this, right? Now you kind of know the root of this argument and where it came from. So why God man? Because it takes both to purchase salvation. It's called the commercial theory. Later, and we'll talk about this later and who this is attributed to, but the argument was really taken out of commercial theory and kind of put in a court of law kind of thing. So we're probably more familiar with that analogy or whatever. So that is Deus Homo. The next book is called Proslogium. And in English it's Proslogion. Simply means discourse. It's Anselm's discourse on the existence of God. How would you like to write a paper, a 26-chapter paper on why you think God exists without using faith or the Bible? So and this is what he took on. He had a sense, even from a small boy that we've talked about, that God exists. And so having this dream and this vision and all this keeps coming back to him, and not only the existence of God in nature, but the existence of God in our hearts. He just had a sense about this, and he believes that it is that sense of God, like a core reality everyone has, and at the center of human thought that gives rise to reason itself. And so he's saying just really because I can think, because I can reason, this in itself is attributed to the fact that God exists. He says that not only is that sense of God proof that God is there, it is proof that everybody believes that God exists. And so basically, Anselm doesn't believe in atheists. What did I say a few weeks ago when you said...
somebody doesn't believe in God and is talking about it shows that they really do.
Okay, and a statement that I made, and this is, by the way, if you wasn't in here, we were talking about how to witness to a Muslim, and Ellen says, that's great, but I don't really run into any Muslims. I want to know how to talk to an atheist, and I made the statement. I said I don't really believe that atheists exist, and so then I read this, and hey, I have a buddy. He doesn't believe atheists exist either. And so we're gonna push that on down the line and end our discussion with that. But let's go ahead and talk about Anselm. He takes this argument and really develops it in this ontological argument called the Proslogion, or Proslogion. All right, so Anselm had a great call to mentor young men, and he really felt this desire to, and I see this in other men today, to pass the torch and to really develop the faith of young men under him. And I see this in Paul and men like Joe Murphy and different ones that have this just desire to train up young men to follow in the footsteps of faith. Anselm writes this. He says, "A youth is like a piece of wax. If the wax is too hard or too soft, it will not receive a perfect image when pressed with a seal. So it is with the ages of men. Old men, untrained in the truth about God, are like hardened wax, and young boys, unable to understand spiritual things, are like soft liquid wax, incapable of receiving a seal. But the young man is pliable. If you teach him, you can shape him as you wish. Knowing this, I watch over the young men with great attention, taking care to nip all of their faults in the bud." See, y'all thought that was just from from Barney, didn't you? Nip it in the bud. Y'all remember that? "So that afterwards, being properly instructed in the practice of holiness, that may form themselves in that image of spiritual men." And so it probably had something to do with his own childhood. He looks back at his own childhood and sees the struggles and sees the hardships that he had. Maybe he didn't have an older man that was really, obviously it wasn't his father. And so he didn't have that man in his life that was really that godly example and that of a righteous man. And so he wanted to make sure that, hey, none of the young men that I know are going to be able to say that, because I want to be that light for them and help them find place. Anselm tells a story about riding through the forest on horseback, and that's just the best I could come up with there. That really has nothing to do with Anselm. But he was riding through the forest on horseback with a group of monks, and they hear some crashing through the leaves and the bushes on the left, and this rabbit just comes bolting out and just stops under Anselm's horse, and it's just sitting under him, just quivering, and they could hear the barking of some dogs in the distance. Some wild dogs had been chasing this rabbit. And so they're chasing this rabbit, and the rabbit is literally seeking refuge within the forelegs of the horse. And so the other monks just start laughing, ha ha, and they're kind of making fun because this rabbit's trying to seek refuge from these dogs. And Anselm gets mad, and he starts to cry a little bit, and he says, this creature is in distress, and it comes to us from help, and you laugh at it. The party was over. They weren't feeling very chipper then. But that's the way he felt too. That when people, and he even made the comparison. He said, "How many people have come to us for help, and we laughed at them." And as a side note, as Christians, as followers of Christ, it's imperative that we have a heart of compassion.
Yes.
Whatever the plight of somebody, whatever trouble they're going through, whatever that looks like to you, if they're in distress, we need to have a heart of compassion and not laugh or not make fun. And so this was kind of Anselm's thought toward that. In 1066, William the Conqueror indeed invades England, and this is the Norman invasion. Remember last week we talked about the different stages of invasion into England. So this is the Norman invasion. He calls Lanfranc to be archbishop, just as he had planned on doing, and he knew the people of England wanted good, strong Christian leadership, and so Lanfranc really satisfied this desire. William died in 1087. His son succeeded him. His son's name was Rufus. And you thought that was just a southern name. It was probably southern England, maybe. But he would appoint Christian leaders, really. He was kind of in the mind, remember when we were talking about Otto the First in the Holy Roman Empire, and how Otto looked at the church as kind of a way to manipulate society and gain favor and stuff like this. And this is kind of Rufus's thought about the church. And so he would appoint Christian leaders and have say in the leadership of the church that would be people that would be beholding to him, and that he could kind of control and this kind of thing. So it really led to a lot of corruption within the church during this time. And the people saw this, they saw what was going on, and so they really demanded that Rufus would install Anselm as the Archbishop of Canterbury, because they wanted good, solid leadership again for the church and not all this corruption. Well, Anselm didn't want to do that either, but he relented. He comes to Canterbury and becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093, and he really had a stormy relationship with Rufus, because Anselm wasn't beholding to the political powers or whatever, and he didn't play that game. He called Rufus out on a number of occasions, and he would send letters to him and chastise him, and so it was really stormy as he opposed this corruption. Rufus died and was replaced by Henry the First. This is the first of the Henrys. If you remember, Henry the First was the first, right? And who was the last Henry? David Henry. No, wait, not David Henry. Henry the Eighth. Y'all remember Henry VIII? Okay, so we had Henry the First to Henry VIII. So this Henry was the first, and there was a stormy relationship with him as well, because this Henry the First was still kind of in that same vein as trying to use the church for his own purposes, and Anselm pushed back against that at every opportunity. Anselm died in 1109 at the age of 76, and he was buried next to Lanfranc in Canterbury. And so his mentor and his the person that had trained him in the faith, he was laid to rest alongside him.
As far as you know, he never married?
As far as I know, he didn't. In Romans 1:18, it says, I'm going to pull back a little bit so y'all can see that. Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived even since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So we're going to talk a little bit today about atheists. And that, you don't even have to read that. I just put that on the screen for the, what do you call that? The footnotes. These are my footnotes, okay? If we set aside what we believe, all right, about God and who God is and what our definitions of who God is, and we just set that aside for a second and take a general approach of who in the world believes in some type of deity or higher power from a multiple of sources, these and even some others, using the best methods for a global survey, 91% to 93% of the world believe there is some type of deity or higher power. And I looked this up several ways because that seemed high to me. Then again, using my own definition, of course. But if you just think generally, 91 to 93% believe in some type of deity or higher power or spiritual existence of some kind. How many missionaries have you seen their story or heard from or whatever, and they went to some remote, dark, unreached people group, and they show up and they already have established some type of worship and some type of gods that they pray to, and sometimes it's even demonic, sometimes it's not, but some type of worship and rituals that they go through because of some type of inclination to have a spiritual expression. And so if you take all of that, if you think about it, we are pre-wired to believe in God. But according to a Pew Research Center global study of 230 countries and territories, 16% of the world's population is not affiliated with a religion. Now, affiliated is kind of a loose term, you understand. That's not saying that 84% of the people go to some type of house of worship every Sunday. That's not even part of it. But they affirm that they're affiliated with some type of religion. All right, so that's 84% of the world's population that identifies with some religious group. All right, so that's pretty huge. So obviously this doesn't mean Christian or even means that they attend any kind of religious service. In the U.S., the same Pew Research Center survey in 2017, of 4,700 U.S. adults, 56 believe in God as described in the Bible. 33% generally believe in a higher power or spiritual force. 10% do not believe in any higher power or spiritual force. And so if you want to say hardline atheists, you're only looking at 10%. If you're one of the 90%, 91, 93% that believe there's some type of God or higher power out there, what's the next question?
Who is it?
Who is it? What's the truth? And so that's where we get into denominations and religions and all these other things in our human wrestling with who is God. Where do I direct this desire to worship? Where do I place my affection toward this higher power? So I want to go back to the longer verse that I read in Romans. We're going to refer back to that in pieces now. In verse 19 and 20, oh, I already said that. 19 and 20, it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." Some acknowledge their belief but take no responsibility with that belief. They just kind of leave it there. Some are persuaded by counterfeits to the true God. And so, we believe in the one true God, and we see out there that you even alluded to it right there, that there are people that present counterfeits and say, hey, instead of the God you already think you know, how about this situation over here, and try to throw counterfeits up. Some find God and pursue greater understanding. That would be you. All right? You acknowledge God and you pursue that and try to learn more about God. So what about those that profess that there is no God or higher power? Let's talk about them for just a little bit. As I've already mentioned, personally I don't believe in atheists. I don't think they exist. Without God, without a creator, all that is that would mean to say that all has happened accidentally. And like Paul was saying just then, to me, even the dumbest person can't really believe that. That the complexity, and I mean, we all have our own examples of that, but we've heard a lot about medical stuff over the last year and a half, haven't we? And just the complexity of the way that our body fights off viruses, and just everything that goes on, the working, you mentioned the eye, and everything about our bodies, everything about the universe, everything is too complex for it to just have happened. Anybody know who Ray Comfort is?
Yes.
Okay. I've watched some videos of him, and he has it's a video, it's really worth a watch. It came out in 2016, the Atheist Delusion movie. Look that up, it's pretty cool. So he goes around, he gives them a book, and he says, hey, look at this book, and has them look through it, and look at those pictures, and look at those words on the page, and then he'll ask them the question, did that book create itself? And they're like, that's dumb, that's silly. It's like, no, really, did the pictures fall onto the page, and did the color arrange itself, and did the words come in coherent sentences and just flow across the page, and did the pages come together, and did the binding come in, the cover come on it, and they're just like, this is absurd. And so he relates that, obviously, to creation and says, then how can you believe that the complexity around you just happened? And the question was, so if this book didn't create itself, what does that tell you about this book? And, well, somebody had to create it. And he said, then if this book had a creator, what does that tell you about the earth around you? It couldn't just create itself. The earth couldn't create itself. And you could even take it back, this isn't on there, but my thought, I've had this conversation with somebody before, where they wanted to keep coming, well, everything on life came from that single cell or whatever. It's like, well, where'd that cell come from? All earth started with a big bang. Well, what happened before the big bang? What was here then? Let's keep going back. And, at some point, they just throw their hands up and like, huh? There has to be an origin. So if everything created itself, where did it come from? Yeah, go. I don't believe in atheists, and some of these ideas have already floated around. I don't believe in atheists because of these reasons. I believe that most who claim to be atheists simply don't want to shoulder the responsibility of acknowledging that there is a God. Because if you say there's a God, you have to do something with that. You either have to reject it, and I've shared in like trying to get someone to a point of salvation before, and talk to them about the decision. And when you get to that point of decision, like, well, maybe you've never heard this before, but now you have. And so you walk away from this either saying yes or no. I mean, you can't walk away from this and say, I've never known, because now you know. And so you walk away with either yes or no. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Some choose unbelief because of, this is what you were saying a while ago, but because of something happened. This wouldn't have happened if God existed. And so they choose not to. It's not that they don't believe in God. They choose to ignore the existence of God because of something that happened. There was a triggering event. This verse was not in the original collection, but Romans 1:25 is a couple of verses under that. Says, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. And so because believing in God was hard, instead of processing that with what happened to them, they chose to believe a lie. And so they turned away from what I still believe is in there as a truth. There's a kernel of truth in there, but they're turning away from that and looking the other way. There's a word for this. It's clear deception. There is an evil one. There is an enemy that's out for the soul of every man and woman. And if he can deceive you into turning away from God because of something that happened to you, then he will do that. Another reason I don't believe in atheists is the resistance atheists have toward those who believe in God. If you don't believe in God, then why are you talking about it? And this goes to what I said a few weeks ago. It's like just the fact that you're arguing with me that there is no God, you're having to acknowledge God to argue with me about God. So you would be better off if you didn't believe in God, just ignore it altogether. But why do you think it is that there's, and not all of them are, okay, but there are, I'm going to say, militant atheists. It's not okay for them just to not believe in God. They have to make sure nobody else believes in God. And if the majority of the people in the world don't agree with you, then that makes you look wrong. Verse 20 of our passage earlier, it says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. And so it doesn't really give anybody an out, does it? It says these things have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. I've heard the argument before, well, what if a missionary never gets to the remote part of Congo and they don't hear and then they die and go to hell? Isn't that unfair? It's like Romans 1:20. For they're without excuse. Because God has revealed himself to everyone. It's also putting, once you acknowledge God, then there's the seeking for the truth about God. That's where we come in. That's the mandate to go into the world and preach the gospel and make disciples. Because then it's about finding the truth, finding that part of them that believes in God and say, let me tell you about this God that you have just some type of internal feeling to worship. Let me tell you about this God. In a writing called A Monologue on the Reason of Faith, Anselm states, anyone of even moderate intelligence should be able to easily reason the existence of God. So he takes this short monologue and he develops it extensively in the Proslogion. And his discourse expanded on this idea, on the ideas of the monologue. His ontological argument is this: there must be a best thing, a thing which exists and is better than all other things. So that's kind of his working, I don't know if you want to call it a theory or whatever, And he says there must be one thing that's best. So think in your minds, what is the absolute best thing? and among all things, there's something that's best. The best conceivable extant thing is a loving God who would have created the world. The God would be personal because it is better to be personal than non-personal. And this is the different, we talked about when we were talking about Islam, one of the biggest differences between Islam and Christianity is that their God is not personal. There's no interaction. God does not wink an eye at them or look their direction. Everything is just, all their prayers just go up. What do we believe? God loves his creation. God sent his son to die for his creation. God interacts with us. We prayed and we gave testimonies beforehand because we believe that God is a personal God. And so this is kind of what Anselm's saying, that God is a personal God because he's the best, and it's better to be personal than non-personal. The eventual conclusion of this line of reasoning is that such a God must exist because it would be better to exist than not exist. But picture in your head a magical horse with a horn. What did you just imagine? A unicorn. Everybody imagined a unicorn. Okay? By the way, this example is not in the Proslogion. Okay, this is not Anselm. This is for those people he looked down on, so we can understand it. Okay. Since you understand the concept of a unicorn can exist in your understanding. Yes. All right. So we know what a unicorn is because it exists in our understanding. Are unicorns real? To the best of my knowledge, unicorns exist in the following ways. Unicorns do exist in your understanding. Unicorns do not exist in reality. All right? So that's the two choices that Anselm gets to in all things. Okay? Does it exist in reality? Does it exist in your understanding? So he gives the example of a painter, actually.
Yes.
Bob Ross, he painted happy little trees and all this stuff. But Bob Ross, when he walked up to that canvas, what did that canvas look like? It was blank. All right, it was blank. And so, did he just start randomly painting and some trees appear? No.
Yeah.
Maybe.
We don't want to ruin your illustration.
Yeah, please don't. But a painter sees in his head before it's ever reality on paper. So he has the understanding of that picture. And this by the way, is Anselm's illustration. A painter sees it in his head. He has understanding of the painting in his head long before he starts painting. Okay? Then after he paints the picture, not only is that painting a reality in his understanding, but now it's an actual reality in real life. So then he asks us to imagine the greatest possible being that's out there. If you do so, the being you imagine would have to be maximally good, just, wise, powerful, etc. Okay? So if you're thinking about the best being, the greatest possible being, those are the attributes that you're going to subscribe to him. So if you're imagining such a being, then the being exists in your understanding, yes? Okay? So that being exists in your understanding. The question then is, does this being also exist in reality? And the answer is either yes or no. All right? So does this being also exist in reality? A would be this being exists only in your understanding and not in reality. And B, this being exists both in your understanding and in reality. So the atheist would say that the being exists only in your understanding and not in reality. Anselm would argue that if you say that, then you aren't imagining the greatest thing. Because there must be a greatest thing. Remember, that was the basis. There must be a greatest thing. And so if A were true, the being that you're imagining would both be the greatest possible being and not the greatest possible being, which is a contradiction. And so literally, it's inconceivable to answer A. All right, is your room spinning yet? That's why I don't read a lot of philosophy. Chapter 3 says it like this. God cannot be conceived not to exist. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That which can be conceived not to exist is not God. And sounds like Romans 7 a little bit, doesn't it? And it assuredly exists so truly that it cannot be conceived not to exist. For it is possible to conceive of a being which cannot be conceived and not to exist. And this is greater than the one which can be conceived not to exist. Hence, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived can conceive not to exist, it is not that than which nothing greater can... I'm sorry. I'm not laughing at what's on the page. I'm laughing at my ability to read it coherently. But this is an irreconcilable contradiction. There is then so truly a being than which nothing greater can be conceived to exist, that it cannot even be conceived not to exist, and this being you are, O Lord our God. And so basically he's saying it's inconceivable because there must be a greatest thing. It's inconceivable to say that there is no God or higher power because there must be a greatest thing. He contributes unbelief to a lack of understanding. An atheist would argue that there is no God is not a contradiction. I mean, it's not a contradiction for me to say there is no God, but Anselm would disagree. Chapter 4 says, for in one sense, an object is conceived when the word signifying it is conceived, and in another, when the very entity which the object is understood. Okay, so I have a better example of that, okay? I think in visual. Anybody visual people?
Yes,
Okay. You know what that is? Okay. How many sides does a triangle have? Can I say that a triangle does not have 3 sides?
No. Well, you can say
Why
it.
can I not say that?
Say it, but it's not true.
Okay. But I can utter the words, a triangle does not have 3 sides, right? But that doesn't make it so. What he's saying is that, sure, a person can utter these words, but if they truly understood triangles, then they would know that a triangle has 3 sides. And so we believe we're people that, not to the fullest extent, understand God, right? And so it's easy for us to talk about God and his attributes and the things that we've seen him do in our lives and the miracles that we've seen. It's easy for us to understand that because we have an understanding of God. People that do not have an understanding of God, they don't understand triangles. So they're saying, well, it has 4 sides. Well, it has 6 sides. Well, it don't have any sides or whatever because they don't understand triangles. And so Anselm is saying that people that say there is no God is because they have no understanding of God. But this is just a brief glimpse of the 26 chapters of the Proslogion. And so it's a good read. You ought to just pick it up and read it tonight or something. Who's going to commit to having that read by class next week?
How many times does it use the word conceived?
Okay, I got no hands on that one. So, ending discussion question. An atheist, they don't believe in God for a reason. And we've talked about some of that, okay? It could have been something that happened. It could have been a lack of understanding. There could be a lot of things. So if you get a chance to talk to someone that doesn't believe in God, ask them, why don't you believe in God? And listen. How many of these things do we have? Okay? Those of you who are active witnessers, you know how important it is to listen, right? Because a lot of times a person will tell you what it will take to convince them. But you have to listen. How many times do we listen to somebody and our mind is thinking of the next thing we're going to say more than actually listening, okay? So ask them, why don't you believe in God? And listen to what they have to say. When they get done, and you don't have to be thinking about what you're going to say because you already know this and we're going to practice it. When they get done, tell them why you believe in God. I'm sure you have reasons. Raise your hand if you have reasons to believe in God. why do you believe in God? If you talk about personal things that have happened to you and things that you've witnessed and things that you are testifying to, they can't argue your experience. You know, I mean, there's things I've done that none of you've done, and you could say I didn't do it, but I did. You know, because I experienced it. And so when you experience God, learn how to articulate that experience to other people, because they can't argue with your experience. They can't take that away from you. I want you to carry this with you this week, okay? Think about, every day this week, just think about, God, why do I believe in you? Because honestly, sometimes we believe something for so long that we can forget the why, can't we? Because we just do. It's who we are. And that's okay. I mean, I am a Christian. This is what I live. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is how I identify. But let's not lose the why. Why do you believe in God? Think about that this week, and maybe that's good. Like when you're instead of counting sheep, lay in bed and just contemplate. God, why do I believe in you? And just think about the reasons for why you believe in God. And God might, because that's come up in your head, God might use that and give you a divine appointment with someone to use that conversation.